The tow truck's engine growled like a beast in the morning silence. Jack Wallace shot up from his recliner on the porch, coffee sloshing from his mug as he heard the unmistakable sound of chains rattling against steel. His eyes locked onto the sight that would trigger a war. Some punk in a reflective vest was hooking his military jeep up to a tow truck. His military jeep. The same vehicle that had rolled through deserts, climbed mountains, and carried wounded soldiers out of hellholes. And now, a bunch of clipboard-wielding suburban overlords had the audacity to take it away like it was some abandoned grocery cart in a parking lot. Jack's boots hit the pavement before his brain had fully processed the absurdity of what he was witnessing. The kid operating the tow truck, 20-something, maybe younger, still chewing on a fast-food breakfast sandwich, glanced at him with the dull indifference of someone who'd been yelled at 100 times before. But this was different. This wasn't some angry homeowner in pajama pants. This was a man who had commanded battalions, stared down enemy fire, and personally chewed out senators without blinking. "Son, I'm gonna need you to unhook that jeep," Jack said, voice level, but carrying the weight of decades of authority. The kid wiped mustard from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Orders from the HOA, sir. Says here it's an unauthorized vehicle. Been marked for removal." Jack stepped closer, reading the paperwork the kid held out like a shield. His name wasn't even on it. Just a generic citation claiming his Jeep was a visual obstruction, and that, as a non-member of the Homeowners Association, he was subject to penalties. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Jack asked, his tone shifting just slightly. The kid hesitated. "Look, sir, I just do what they tell me. If you got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Jack didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His expression alone made the tow truck driver reconsider his entire career path. But orders were orders, and with a final glance at Jack, the kid shrugged, climbed into the truck, and drove off, hauling Jack's Jeep away like some defeated trophy. Jack stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, staring at the empty patch of driveway where his Jeep had been. He took a slow breath. Then he exhaled just as slowly. He wasn't mad. Not yet. This wasn't anger. This was something far more dangerous. This was the calm before the storm. An hour later, he was standing in front of Richard Alberts, the self-important president of the HOA, a man who had never served a day in uniform but carried himself with the smugness of a four-star general of the neighborhood. Richard sat in a ridiculous little golf cart, clipboard in hand, sipping an iced coffee like he was presiding over an empire. "Ah, Mr. Wallace," Richard said, not bothering to stand. "I was expecting you." Jack didn't return the pleasantry. "Where's my Jeep?" Richard let out a small, satisfied sigh. "Towed, per HOA regulations. You've refused multiple requests to register as a member, and as such, your vehicle is in violation of our neighborhood standards." Jack studied him, the way Richard's fingers twitched slightly when he sipped his drink, the way his eyes darted toward the housewives walking by, like he was performing for an audience. This was a man who thrived on control. Jack had dealt with his type before. The kind of guy who built his identity on rules he never had to enforce himself. "You want me to pay you to live in my own house?" Jack said, deadpan. "It's not about money," Richard replied with a tight smile that suggested it was entirely about money. "It's about maintaining standards." Jack chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Standards, huh? Let me tell you about standards, Richard. I've seen men dig trenches in monsoon rains. I've watched medics hold together wounds with their bare hands because they had no supplies. I've seen soldiers fight for every inch of ground, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And you're telling me my Jeep, is a threat to the standards of this cul-de-sac monarchy of yours." Richard's smile twitched. "That's a very moving speech, Mr. Wallace. But the fact remains." "The fact remains," Jack interrupted, stepping closer, "that you took my property without so much as a warning. And that means you and I have a problem." Richard finally shifted in his seat, as if realizing for the first time that Jack was not just another homeowner to push around. He cleared his throat and straightened his clipboard. "You're welcome to appeal the decision at the next HOA meeting." Jack stared at him. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. "Fine," Jack finally said. "I'll appeal." Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden compliance. "Well, good. That's how things should be done around here. Through proper channels." Jack nodded, then smiled, and that was the moment Richard should have realized he had made a mistake. That night, Jack sat on his porch with a beer, watching the neighborhood. People had been talking, whispering. Some gave him sympathetic nods. Others pretended not to see him at all. That was fine. He wasn't interested in sympathy. He was interested in result. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Shadow," he said when the voice on the other end picked up. "Jack," the voice replied. "Been a while. You finally need my services?" Jack's smile widened. "I need some intel. HOA leadership. Financials. Emails. Anything that smells like corruption." A pause. Then a low chuckle. "You really don't do small fights, do you?" "Never have, never will," Jack said, taking another sip of beer. "Let's see what Richard Alberts is really hiding." The game had begun. Jack arrived at the impound lot just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over rows of confiscated vehicles. The place smelled of grease and desperation, the kind of place where people came to beg for their cars back, only to be met with blank stares and sky-high fees. He had been in worse places. War zones. Enemy territory. Congressional hearings. This was just another battlefield. A teenager sat behind the counter, slumped in his chair, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when Jack approached. "Towing receipts?" the kid muttered. Jack placed his hands on the counter. "I'm here for my Jeep." The kid yawned and finally looked at him. "Got a citation number?" Jack handed over the crumpled paper the tow truck driver had left him. The kid typed lazily into his computer, his gums smacking loudly. After a few seconds, he nodded toward the back lot. "Yeah, it's here. Gonna be a $200 release fee." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not paying." The kid sighed, clearly used to this kind of pushback. "Look, man, I don't make the rules. If you got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Jack leaned in just slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Listen carefully, son. That Jeep has been through more battles than your entire family tree. It's carried wounded men through enemy fire, outrun mortar strikes, and survived places the news won't even report on. And you're telling me some neighborhood pencil pusher gets to decide whether I can have it back?" The kid swallowed. Look, I just..." Before he could finish, a heavy voice rumbled from behind the gate. "Jack Wallace." Jack turned, his face breaking into a grin. A stocky man in oil-stained coveralls stepped out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. The man had a scar running down his left cheek and the unmistakable presence of someone who had seen real action. "Murphy," Jack said. "Didn't think I'd see you again outside a war zone," Murphy chuckled, stepping forward and shaking Jack's hand with a grip like a vice. "Heard about what happened?" "HOA nonsense." Jack nodded. "They took my Jeep." Murphy snorted, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. Civilians get a little bit of power, and suddenly they think they're running a dictatorship." Jack tilted his head toward the lot. "Any chance you can help me out here?" Murphy grinned. "For you? No charge." The kid at the desk stammered. "Wait, but..." Murphy waved him off. "Relax, kid. This man has done more for this country than your entire HOA put together. If you got a problem, tell your boss I said so." The kid shut his mouth. 10 minutes later, Jack was behind the wheel of his Jeep, the engine purring like a beast finally set free. He gripped the steering wheel, rolling his shoulders as he took in the familiar feel of it. The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. By the time he got home, the wheels in his mind were already turning. He parked the Jeep conspicuously on his driveway, making sure it was visible from every angle. If the HOA wanted to challenge him again, they'd have to do it to his face. Inside, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his chair. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Shadow," the voice on the other end answered. "Need a favor," Jack said. There was a brief pause before Shadow chuckled. "Must be serious if you're calling me." Jack exhaled. "I need everything on the HOA leadership. Financials, emails, any dirt you can find. Give me an hour." Jack hung up and sipped his drink, watching the street through his window. He had been in enough battles to know when an enemy was getting overconfident. The HOA thought they had won by towing his Jeep. They had no idea who they were dealing with. His phone buzzed exactly an hour later. "Jack," Shadow's voice came through. "You're gonna love this." Jack smirked. "What do you got?" "Your HOA president? Richard Alberts? He's been funneling neighborhood fees into a personal account. Charging extra for beautification projects that never happen. Overbilling residents for repairs that don't exist. The guy's a walking scandal." Jack's smirk widened. "Send me everything. Already in your inbox." Jack opened his laptop and scrolled through the files Shadow had sent. Bank statements, emails. A full breakdown of how Richard had been lining his pockets while pretending to be some law-abiding leader of the community. Jack leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. He could go straight to the residence, expose Richard in front of everyone. But that would be too easy. No, this required something more tactical. The next morning, Jack went to work. He made a few more calls. He reached out to a few contacts. Local veterans, retired law enforcement officers, people who had no patience for bureaucratic crooks. He didn't need an army. He just needed the right people in the right places. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Jack was ready. The community center was packed, tension hanging in the air as Richard Alberts stood at the front, his usual smug expression barely concealing the unease in his eyes. He had heard the rumors. He knew something was coming. Jack waited until the meeting was in full swing before standing up. "I have a question," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Richard sighed. "Mr. Wallace, if this is about your vehicle—" "This is about you," Jack interrupted. "Specifically, how you've been using HOA funds for personal gain." A murmur spread through the crowd. Richard scoffed. "That's a ridiculous accusation." Jack held up a folder. "Bank statements say otherwise." Silence. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Is this true, Richard?" Richard tried to regain control. "This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. I can explain." Jack stepped forward. "Save it. You've been charging people for non-existent projects. You've been embezzling funds while threatening homeowners with fines and citations. And I've got the proof right here." Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. This is an invasion of privacy." Jack smiled. "Funny. That's exactly what I thought when you stole my Jeep." The room erupted. Homeowners shouted questions, demanding answers. The board members whispered among themselves, distancing themselves from Richard with every passing second. Jack stepped back, watching the chaos unfold. This wasn't his battle anymore. He had delivered the strike. The neighborhood would take care of the rest. As the meeting ended in a flurry of accusations and panic, Jack walked out, hands in his pockets, whistling to himself. Richard Alberts had spent years treating the HOA like his personal kingdom. Now, his empire was crumbling. Richard Alberts had always been a man who thrived on control. For years, he had ruled the HOA like a king, wielding citations and fines like weapons. But now, standing in front of a room full of angry homeowners, his power was slipping through his fingers. His carefully constructed empire was unraveling, and the worst part was that he had no idea how to stop it. Jack watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, as residents bombarded Richard with questions he couldn't answer. Where had their money gone? Why had fees increased while nothing in the neighborhood had actually improved? Why were some homeowners getting special treatment while others were getting their cars towed for no reason? Richard stammered through half-hearted explanations, but no one was buying it. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that their names were tied to this sinking ship. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes and a lifetime of experience reading people, finally spoke up. "Richard, is it true?" she asked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Did you misuse HOA funds?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack smirked to himself. He had seen this before, in a different setting. A leader caught red-handed, trying to save face, but the room had already turned against him. There was no winning this fight. Richard was done, and he knew it. "I think we should vote," another board member said. Effective immediately. It wasn't even a debate. The votes came in, and just like that, Richard Alberts was removed as HOA president. His face had gone pale. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to process the sudden downfall. 1 minute he had been the king of the cul-de-sac. The next, he was just another homeowner with no power. Jack stepped forward, just close enough for Richard to hear him. "Looks like you've been overthrown." Richard turned sharply, eyes filled with rage. "You think you've won?" Jack shrugged. "I think justice won." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you've done." Jack leaned in slightly. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done. I made sure people like you don't get to push people like me around." Richard had no comeback. He stormed out of the meeting, his face red with anger and embarrassment. The moment the door slammed behind him, the tension in the room released all at once. Homeowners started talking to each other, some relieved, some still shocked at how quickly everything had unraveled. Jack didn't stick around to hear the aftermath. His job was done. By the time he made it back home, he could already feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He parked his Jeep in the driveway, standing there for a moment just to admire it. The whole mess had started because of this vehicle, and now it sat exactly where it belonged. Jack wasn't even inside for 10 minutes before his doorbell rang. He opened it to find one of the former board members, the same older woman who had been sharp enough to see through Richard's nonsense. "Mr. Wallace," she said with a small smile. "That was quite the performance back there." Jack nodded. "I just pointed out the facts." "Well, I think we could use someone like you." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh." She folded her arms. "We're going to need a new HOA president. Someone who understands leadership. Someone who knows how to stand up to corruption." Jack almost laughed. "You want me to run the HOA?" "Not run it. Fix it." Jack thought about it. He had spent his entire life leading people, commanding forces, fighting battles, and now, in retirement, he had planned on taking it easy. But then again, he had always believed in doing what was right. If that meant stepping up one more time, so be it. "I'll consider it," he said finally. She smiled, giving him a knowing nod. "That's all we ask." As she walked away, Jack glanced back at his Jeep, the battle-worn machine that had carried him through so much. He had thought his days of fighting were over. Maybe they never really were. Maybe some battles just took a different shape. A few days later, Richard Alberts packed up and left town. No one knew exactly where he went, and no one really cared. His house went up for sale. The neighborhood began to change, just little things at first. People actually started talking to each other, working together instead of living under the threat of fines and penalties. Jack sat on his porch one evening, sipping a beer, watching the sunset over the neighborhood he had unexpectedly helped save. He had faced down corrupt officials, hostile forces, and impossible odds before. But taking down an HOA? That had been one for the books. As he leaned back, stretching his legs, he heard a familiar voice from the street. "You gonna run things differently, General?" Jack looked up to see Murphy standing there, arms crossed, grinning. Jack raised his bottle in a mock toast. "I figure I'll take it one battle at a time." Murphy chuckled. "Well, if you need reinforcements, you know where to find me." Jack nodded. He had always known that war never really ended. The battlefield just changed. And for now, at least, this was one fight he had won. He took another sip of his beer and let out a slow breath. Peace at last. At least until the next idiot tried something stupid.